Gemini said, "In the vast and terrifying darkness of the Pacific Ocean during the early months of the war, the night belonged to the Empire of Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent decades perfecting the art of night warfare, training its lookouts, the famous sightseers, to spot the silhouette of an enemy ship thousands of meters away in pitch black. These men were the elite, selected for their exceptional night vision, and were given enormous binoculars mounted on the decks of cruisers and battleships. For a Japanese captain in 1942, the night was his ally, a protective cloak under which his long lance torpedoes could glide invisibly toward American hulls. They firmly believed that fighting spirit and superior optical training would always prevail over Western technology. But that confidence was about to turn into deadly confusion and ultimately into utter terror in the face of an enemy who, inexplicably, could see through darkness, rain, and fog. The change didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual nightmare that began in the shark-infested waters around Guadalcanal. At first, reports from Japanese commanders who survived night skirmishes were met with skepticism at headquarters. They spoke of American fire that was eerily accurate in zero visibility. At the Battle of Cape Esperance in October 1942, the cruiser Helena used its SG radar, a new microwave technology that had just arrived at the front, to detect the Japanese fleet in total darkness. While Japanese lookouts strained their eyes against the black horizon, searching for any trace of foam or shadow, American gunners were already receiving firing solutions. When the shells started falling, there were no warning shots, no pre-fire flares, just direct hits. To the Japanese sailors on deck, it was as if the enemy had made a pact with the devil. How could they possibly know they were there? Many Japanese officers rationalized these early encounters by attributing them to bad luck, coastal spies, or the Americans simply guessing their position. They couldn't conceive that a machine could replace the human eye. As 1943 progressed, bad luck became a terrifying pattern. The massive introduction of radar to the U.S. fleet began to change the very physics of naval warfare. Radar didn't just detect the presence of ships. Fire control radar allowed gunnery directors to aim main guns with mathematical precision without even looking out the window. On Japanese bridges, frustration mounted. They continued to rely on their hit-and-run tactics at night, but every time they tried to close in under cover of darkness, they were met with a hail of steel before they were even within range to launch their torpedoes. The confusion among the Japanese crews was palpable. Imagine being on a destroyer in the middle of a tropical storm where the rain is so heavy you can't see the bow of your own ship, and suddenly the ship next door explodes. There are no flashes of enemy guns visible on the horizon, only death coming from nowhere. This was the reality of centimeter-level radar. What the Japanese didn't fully grasp was the sophistication of what went on inside the Combat Information Centers, or CICs, on American ships. While the Japanese bridge was a place of shouting, orders through voice tubes, and men peering through binoculars in the rain, the American CIC was a dark room, illuminated by the ghostly green glow of radar screens. There, the war became an abstract video game before video games even existed. Operators saw blips or patches of light representing the enemy fleet. They could see the Japanese formation, its speed, and its exact heading. There was nowhere to hide. To the average Japanese sailor, this was technological sorcery. They began to feel like they were naked on the ocean, constantly watched by an eye that never blinked. The psychological tipping point where confusion morphed into bewildered helplessness came in 1944. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, cymically known to Americans as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, radar not only guided the ships, but also directed the air war. American fighter controllers comfortably seated on their aircraft carriers could see waves of Japanese planes assembling hundreds of miles away. They directed their own Hellcat fighters to the precise point of interception long before the Japanese could even spot the American fleet. Veteran Japanese pilots, hoping to surprise the Americans, found themselves ambushed from above and from the sun time and time again. Japanese radio crackled with cries of confusion. Where did they come from? How did they know we were coming along this vector? Japanese air superiority was annihilated not just by better aircraft, but by the omniscience provided by radar. But it was on the surface, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, specifically in Sarajevo Strait, that the disparity became tragically absolute. This was the last battleship battle in history, and it was an execution. Admiral Nishimura's force sailed into the strait in the pre-dawn darkness. Nishimura expected a classic night fight, the kind of close-quarters, chaotic battle he had trained for his entire life. He didn't know he was walking into a perfect mechanical trap. Across the strait, 6 American battleships, many of them resurrected Pearl Harbor veterans like the USS West Virginia, waited in a crisscrossed battle line. The USS West Virginia had the latest fire control radar technology. More than 20 kilometers away, in the pitch black of night, the West Virginia's radar officer could see Nishimura's ships as clearly as if they were in a photograph. "We have a firing solution," was announced in the darkness of the CIC. On the Japanese bridge, all was silence and tension. The lookouts strained their eyes until they hurt, searching for shadows. They saw nothing. Then the horizon exploded. The West Virginia opened fire at 20,000 meters. The first salvo fell directly on the battleship Yamashiro. There were no adjustment shots, no range correction. It was a direct hit on the first salvo in the dead of night from a distance impossible for human vision. To the Japanese sailors on deck, it was as if the enemy had made a pact with the devil. How could they possibly know they were there? Many Japanese officers rationalized these early encounters by attributing them to bad luck, coastal spies, or the Americans simply guessing their position. They couldn't conceive that a machine could replace the human eye. The reaction of the Japanese high command to these reports was one of slow and painful acceptance. They had long dismissed American and British radar as a toy, useful for navigation but not decisive in combat. They believed their own radars, though inferior, were sufficient. But the reality of 1944 and 1945 proved they were fighting an analog war in a digital world. American U-boats equipped with radar decimated the Japanese merchant fleet because they could attack at night and on the surface, detecting convoys at distances where Japanese escorts suspected nothing. A Japanese destroyer captain who survived the war later recounted the feeling of utter powerlessness. "We felt like we were fighting blind men who had suddenly regained their sight while we were left in the dark." Continuous radar coverage meant there was no respite. Before, a ship could retreat to a fog bank or wait for a moonless night to repair damage or resupply. Now, radar pierced fog and night. American patrol aircraft equipped with surface search radar could detect a periscope or a small fishing boat miles away. The Pacific Ocean, once vast and capable of concealing entire fleets, had become small and transparent. This technological omnipotence had a corrosive effect on morale. Knowing that the enemy knows your location always is a heavy psychological burden. Recovered diaries of Japanese soldiers and sailors from the later stages of the war reflect this constant paranoia. They no longer looked to the horizon for ships, they looked to the sky and their instruments, awaiting the inevitable arrival of a radar-guided shell. Tactical surprise, the most prized element of Japanese military doctrine, had been eliminated. They could no longer surprise the Americans. Every movement, every flanking maneuver, every attempt at night reinforcement, Tokyo Express, was detected, tracked, and countered before it could take effect. The Japanese sailors' bewilderment stemmed not only from the fear of death, but from the collapse of their worldview. They had been taught that spirit, will, and courage were the determining factors in warfare. Radar was the antithesis of that. It was cold, impersonal, mathematical, and ruthless. It cared nothing about the Bushido code or sacrifice. It simply calculated distances and angles. When the battleship Yamato, the pride of the fleet and the symbol of Japanese naval power, set sail on its final suicide mission in April 1945, it was tracked with radar almost from the moment it left port. There was no grand naval battle, no duel of titans. It was detected electronically. Swarms of aircraft were directed toward it by radar controllers, and it was sunk without its massive 18-inch guns being able to do much against the invisible threat surrounding it. Ultimately, the story of radar in the Pacific is the story of how technology redefined courage. Japanese sailors fought with undeniable bravery, holding their posts as their ships disintegrated around them. But that bravery crashed against a wall of electromagnetic waves. The image of a rain-soaked Japanese lookout holding his binoculars and desperately searching for a shadow in the night, while 20 kilometers away an American radar operator chewed gum and adjusted a dial to mark his death, perfectly encapsulates the tragedy and transformation of naval warfare in the 20th century. It was the triumph of the electron over the human eye, and it left one of the most powerful navies in history not only defeated, but utterly stunned by a force they could not see, touch, or comprehend until it was too late. The night, once their greatest ally, had become their grave, illuminated only by the green glow of a phosphor screen on the far horizon.